My name is Subin. I'm an Access Services Assistant here at Poets House. For those of you who are new to this space, Poets House is a nonprofit poetry library and literary center that is free and open to the public. We have one of the most comprehensive independent poetry collections available on open shelves. Our library includes over 100,000 volumes of poetry, and we host readings, workshops, and youth programs. Tonight, poet and artist Wendy Xu will give a talk on the poetry of Frank Lima, followed by a Q&A. Our Password series invites poets to speak about another poet who has influenced their work. Our upcoming Passwords events include Jawed Mojadedi on Rumi's Masnavi on May 6th and Jake Skeets on Joy Harjo on May 20th. Tonight's event and the entire Password series was made possible thanks to the generous support of the Battery Park City Authority. I got to discover Frank Lima in preparation for this event. I was acquainted with his poetry through a collection titled Angel, which has a signature and inscription by Pulitzer-winning composer Ned Rorem, dated 1977, that reads, I, dot. I think this might have been like a dig to Lima's writing style. It's lyrical but conversational. It often begins with something grounded in the mundane that extends into morality and mortality. In Simpson Street, he writes, I see dogs in the street and they remind me of my coffee. I watch the nightgown in the next room and they avoid the animals in the empty bottles. I rub the back of the mattress and announce the war between us. In Hunter, he says, I hold my hands at the bottom of the river. In Soliloquy, he says, I'm looking for your neck. Helen Vendler, a poetry critic for the New York Times, suggested that Lima's work defined the New York school by standing outside it. He has influences from Lorca and other poets, but in the end, his poetry is always individually himself. Also, with the context of Ned Rorem's music career, though, the inscription could be like a Roman numeral 1 instead of an I. That's like kind of far-fetched. The one chord is the foundational chord built on the first note of a musical key. It acts as home or the tonic, providing a sense of resolution in music. For those of us who call New York City home, Lima's poetry also captures the contemporary urban experience, drawing from his experience growing up in Spanish Harlem, getting his MFA at Columbia, and writing among the New York School poets. I want to thank Wendy for illuminating Frank Lima's poetry and legacy. Tonight, before formally introducing her, I'd like to invite you all to a couple upcoming events. This Saturday on April 18th from 12 to 6, we're having our 40th anniversary celebration reading. There'll be 40 poets, there'll be cake, there'll be wine, there'll be free food, and live music, as well as 40 poets reading in a marathon style. On Thursday, April 23rd, we're hosting a reading from new chapbooks by poets Katya Borkov, David M.K., Asha Futterman, and Jed Munson, and Riley Ratcliffe. So now, without further, I'll formally introduce Wendy. Wendy Xu is a poet and writer and assistant professor of writing at the New School in New York City. She is the author of 3 full-length collections of poetry, including The Past and Phrasis, is that right? Named one of the 10 best poetry books of 2017 by New York Times Book Review, and a book on poetics entitled Your Historical Loveliness Knows No Bounds. Her work has appeared in the Best American Poetry, Granta Poetry, New York Review of Books, The New Republic, Conjunctions, and widely elsewhere. Born in Shandong, China in 1987, she lives in Brooklyn. Please give a warm welcome to Wendy.
Thank you, Subin. That was great. Oh my God, there's a note up here that says, please speak close into the microphone, smiley face. It's so thoughtful. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, thanks for coming, and thanks also for inviting me. Passwords, I'm going to refer to Passwords like it's an entity to this event. I think that this is such an important series. There's so many great places where you get invited to talk about your own work, which is great and always a lot of fun, but I think there's not enough spaces where we can sort of like praise and talk about somebody else, especially someone like Lima, who was really underread in his time and is still kind of underread. So I think this is really exciting. Please talk to me afterwards, because we won't make this 9 hours, but we can talk more afterwards. I thought that I would share that in preparing for this event, I had two kind of like conflicting wishes. One of those wishes was that like I would show up and like every single one of you and the bunch of people that are on Zoom, like everybody, you would all know already who Frank Lima is. You would be like, oh yeah, Frank Lima, I read him all the time. You'd be super familiar with his work. That to me would be so like correct. You know, to me that would be exactly what Lima's work really deserves. That was one of my wishes. My other wish is that I would show up and not a single one of you would have ever heard of Frank Lima, let alone read his work, so that then I could do my work, which is like shout for the next 45 minutes about how, you know, amazing his work is, and how profound and kind of singular I think that he really is. That wish is also, the important part of it is that I wouldn't have to work against what has actually really defined his work, which is like a sort of footnotification, is I guess what I'll call it, in the history of the New York school. He has kind of, his legacy has kind of endured that experience. And we talk about the New York school as if it's already complete, as if it's a sort of like historical thing. It's over there, it's finished. I mean, I would argue, obviously, that's not the case. So I felt like my two wishes were appropriate in getting ready to talk about someone who also just inhabited a lot of in-betweenness during his life, which I'll talk more about. Lima is someone who, to me, really, really frustrates these kind of categorical truths that we have about American poetry, outsider poetry, class, race in poetry, New York poetry. You could kind of go on and on. Especially, I think, what we tend to call poetry from, and I'm going to use air quotes liberally, right? Poetry from marginalized experiences, you know, as if that's also a sort of clean category. So the biographical stuff, Frank Lima did publish 3 books in his lifetime in the 60s and 70s. Inventory was in 64, Underground with the Oriole was in 71, and then Angel, which was referenced in 1976. And then from there, it would be actually another 20 years before New and Selected finally came out, which was also titled Inventory in 1997. And then in 2015, City Lights did us all a very, very long overdue favor and published Incidents of Travel in Poetry, which I think one of many things it did that was so important is that, it did select some great poems from early collections, but it really, really focused on the massive amount of unpublished poetry that Lima had left behind. And I think it's really a testament to the fact that some of his best work basically has not been discovered yet by us, by the time this came out. So in the intro here, Garrett Caples, who's a poet and editor, points out, I think, something really important is that we would be pretty hard-pressed to find someone who's more deserving of membership in like second-generation New York school poetry than Lima. Although Lima declined that association throughout his life, he also, I think, it's sort of funny, he declined association with the Beat movement too, although he obviously had like a lot of contact with them, a lot of reason to be associated with them. But he would put it, I think, in a nice way, which is that he was kind of critical of that urban street life that the Beat generation, he felt tended to romanticize. He was like, I'm trying to get away from that life. It's not, I'm running away from it, not towards it. But all of these New York school poets, second generation, that we talk about, so like Kenneth Koch, Frank O'Hara, which I'll talk more about, Tony Towle, David Shapiro, I'm just going on and on, Joe Chiaravolo, Joe Brainerd, our faves, right, were his friends and his mentors. They were sometimes his roommates. You'll hear in the poems, they were often the people that he was writing with and about, sitting in the room next to him. And a lot of it reads exactly in that kind of New York school way that we like, that we sort of, value. But a lot of these New York school poets, it's also not a secret, right? We're white, middle, and upper middle class, not to mention highly educated. Lima actually somehow did manage to get his MFA from Columbia, but only through the kind of like some help from Kenneth Koch, and he also did not have the degrees he was supposed to have to be able to enroll in that program, but they were like, let's just come on through, Lima came from poverty. He wrote about it all his life. He was born to a Mexican father, a Puerto Rican mother in Spanish Harlem here in New York. Both parents struggled with addiction, alcoholism. Lima himself survived many, many forms of abuse before he started writing. After he started writing, he wrote about it, again, all of his life. These are sort of biographical, things that are in the work themselves. He was also incarcerated many times, fell in and out of petty crime, addiction, juvenile drug rehab, and many, many bouts of homelessness. He still wrote prodigiously, devotedly. His work and his poetry were always, always intertwined. And again, when he passed away in 2013, which is often the case, we really discovered the full amount of work that had not yet been read. So for me, like an easy takeaway here, it doesn't make it less true, but is that Lima's life and his participation in the New York School, it obviously challenges our idea of the New York School itself. I think we really have to make eye contact with the fact that Lima is a major figure in American poetry and he's still underread. He often goes unmentioned or, like I said, footnoted in the history of the school. To me, he's an important poet to read. I'm going to use a kind of vague term in these times, you know what I mean? I find him really instructive, and I'll say more about why, but I think he's worth reading every single day. So David Shapiro described Lima, and I think this is really correct, as writing the poetry of everyday life, and then I think he felt it important to qualify that only a poet of enormous strength and fearlessness is capable of is capable of describing the everyday, which I guess I would really agree with. The everyday is every day. It's everything. It's writing your daily life. It doesn't exclude anything. So to be able to write poetry of every day is something much larger than can even be kind of put into words. So to me, and then we'll kind of get into the poems too. To me, when I first read Frank Lima, he wasn't any of these things. Like I'm giving you this nice biography. He was not in my brain attached to any kind of like cultural or literary matrix. I actually really think that it's great to be like kind of young and dumb and uneducated, right? And you just come across a poet as if they're floating in space. I don't think it's shameful. Or embarrassing. I kind of wish we'd actually say that more often to young poets. There's this feeling like one day you were just looking over there, and a writer or an artist or someone kind of floated across your vision. It's okay to kind of start reading them and have no idea why or who they are. For me, I'm not, sort of glamorizing ignorance, but like that was such a huge part of my first encounter with him. So if I'm interested in Lima first, and all of these kind of like ways that he fits in or doesn't fit in or challenges or doesn't challenge schools and conventions, etc., definitely second. I think that too often it's presented, especially about Frank Lima, that the fact of his fitting into a group is kind of the revelation itself, right? That's the revelation to be had that we should focus on, when really then you're missing the whole revelation of the work itself. We could just spend all day marveling at the fact that he was there, he was at the parties, he's often, photographed in these famous photos of New York school figures. But if we miss the work, I mean, we've missed kind of the whole thing. I don't speak on Lima as like a scholar or a historian. I was in Iowa City getting an English degree at the University of Iowa when Nico Alvarado, a great poet, introduced a group of us to Frank Lima. Right away, I was like, what is this? I want more of this. This is amazing. His poetry was really beautiful and sometimes kind of like shockingly intense. It was surreal and playful. And I'm going to borrow a phrase here. It was kind of full of this feeling that Lima would call a quote unquote like vague terror, that like at any moment someone you love will call you on the telephone, which I'll read that poem a little bit later. And to me just felt so relatable. I was like 19 and I was also like afraid that my crush was going to call me on the phone, and I remember being like, I get that. I just really get that, So I love the poems. I returned to them. Somehow at some point I got the idea in my head that I should write poems too, which is absurd, and I did, and I continued to, like many of us do. And I've just been I've been returning to him ever since. I really wanted to be like Frank. I really wanted to write about sort of the atrocious stuff and the profound stuff next to each other. And I think to this day, I haven't found for myself a better guide for doing that as a very kind of specific poetic act. So on that note, another thing is that I briefly thought about, very seriously too, I briefly thought about making this talk, like I would just get up here and I would read you 45 minutes, I'm not going to do this right, but I would just read you a list of Frank Lima similes, which you could fill many, many talks, right? We would just enjoy it and we would just kind of call it a day. I really think that nobody compares like him. They're like these strange comparisons that only Lima could come up with. I think to me, one of the greatest things that a poet can do is compare, bring two things into relation. It's really the basis, in my opinion, of solidarity and collectivity, but it has to be comparison as setting things equal, right? It can't be comparison with subjugation. If one goes above the other, you know, this does not qualify as sort of a route towards solidarity. I think it's profoundly kind of magical the way that he compares things. So I'm going to share an abridged, I was like, let me honor this weird instinct that I have. I'm going to share an extremely abridged list of Lima similes and metaphors, which is really only like a fraction of his comparing output. So there's no text for this, unfortunately. And these are also from different poems, although I did read them together and I was like, that's a good poem. Maybe that's a cento. I should publish that. Okay, no. So these are just some like Frank Lima simile hits that I really love. One is my kidney like drunken flowers. I mean, may we never feel that way, but you know. When your tongue slipped into the world like a drop of light. I wake up like a net fumbling for love. Secrets like lichens on the moon. Her thoughts are small plates that fly. The present is an orphan with large black eyes who listens to a radio play the same love song over and over again. And the last two are the face endures like a sponge, which is how I feel when I wake up late. The body is a speechless muscle filled with water. I think they're great. So turning to the selection of Lima poems that I picked, obviously very personal. How could it not be? I found it pretty excruciating, to be honest with you, to have to choose. You know, I was like, what if I just don't choose and I just stand up here and like subject these poor people to just reading the whole thing? The choosing was really difficult, and I think for a real reason too. There are so many Limas, and I think anyone that tells you like, oh, you know, Lima at the end of the day was a fighter, right? Lima at the end of the day was a romantic. They're all real, you know, they're all the real Lima. All of them are correct. None of them are kind of, you know, lesser than the other ones. But he was page to page, if you read his work, a fighter. He was a literal boxer for a while. Definitely a lover, married 4 times. The last one stuck. A survivor, definitely often an optimist, but then sometimes you turn the page and, you know, that optimism is gone. Sometimes a believer in redemption, a hustler. He was a really good street historian, a really important, I think, New York City documentary poet. Definitely romantic and a lot of other identities. So I think when I was wondering why it would be worth looking at a selection of what I'm calling his most tender poems, I'm definitely thinking of tenderness not as an aesthetic decision, not as some kind of like technical or poetic affect, right? I'm thinking of it as truly like a life-saving orientation for a poet who, by his own admission, right, was raised and lived most of his life around the hard, the jagged, you know, emotionally and materially. So to me, I think it takes on a greater weight for that reason. As you'll hear in this first poem, Lima is also a poet of really amazing kind of epistolary devotion. When he writes a poem to you, which he often did, I imagine it was quite intense. None of us were lucky enough to have received a poem from Frank. It's really like a needful epistolary poem. It's often very enormous. I hear, you know, like amazing epistolary poets like Emily Dickinson, like that kind of longing of the to you. I also hear the really kind of ecstatic address of like a Rilke, you know, think Sonnets to Orpheus, which related to this poem. Like feeling slightly insane and kind of shouting at Orpheus, shouting at nature at the graveside. I hear all of that in this poem. So the first poem I'm reading is titled Orfeo. subtitled To My Friends, and you'll hear some of those, New York school things that we like, but I also think it's doing something much different. So it's also, it's very large. I love it. Just read along if you want. Okay. Orfeo, To My Friends. Each hair is a poem I gave my son. Each hair is my allowance from the universe. Each hair is a sunspot on someone's broken heart. The secrets that emerge from the psyche have no floor. They will get off on any floor when you least expect them to. They wear shadows that look like my mother. She could stop God, but could not make it snow. She said the weather was a work of art, like the last streak of wonder in Medea's heart. You don't have to watch human sacrifice on television. Shut your window, lock the door, wait for yourself in the corner, in the night, in the little house that holds your tears. There is no piano, just your green velvet and the years you spent in Russia as a little box in your mother's womb, with all her curses and her dreams of men. When I write poetry, I hear voices. Kenneth Koch rubbing his forehead, David Shapiro swatting words, Frank O'Hara blowing his nose. These aren't typos, also the lack of space. Philip Bryant smiling upon me, Neruda drinking red wine, Lorca hailing a cab in New York, Vallejo walking in Paris, Ron Padgett calming the world, Ted Berrigan dignifying wise guy poetry, Joe Chiaravalo on the radio with melanoma in the milky sky. Are you asleep? No. Chopin is asleep on our new sofa. He is wasting his life away. His health looks like a dirty window. His heart has a broken leg. His breathing will go to the grave with him. I'm not one to part. I'm not one to hide my feelings. I'm the end of the corridor in your hands. This is a song of war because love is music and its ferocious notes are oars that pull us apart. Death is incredible. It is man-made. We change the names of the dead when we bury them. In time, they look back at us and see us, the living, like old doors in the wind. In the beginning, there were small islands floating on poetry. These islands belonged to Joe Chiaravalo. Joe's words are the body parts of poetry, like the little children of the fireflies who set songs on fire when we cry. There is work to do on top of the forest. There are too many words on top of the forest. They are obscuring our conversation. If the trees aren't pruned, our words will never reach their destination, the telephones that hate love and protect the dead from living. Will my daughter dress like Venus, wrapped in exaggerated hopes? Will the pill invent love for her? Will her life take place on a mental and spiritual planet? Yes, my daughter is a seed full of steam, leaving me behind like a bad marriage. Helen, Helen, my Helen of Troy. Once I placed a kiss on a spider's web because there is no evil in nature. The spider laughed. Now the kiss is as free as an insect and the better part of our love. My other marriages were like the 4 seasons that come and go. They have left me small stones that spend their nights on the balcony of life, watching pathos and comedy celebrate their wedding. Tonight I will write poetry. I will pile the world on my pillow like a paramilitary sous chef, toss an avalanche of flowers with sunlight and olive oil. And then there's this funny kind of, you can read it almost as like a cheeky faux sign off, like David Shapiro, right? Like as if David Shapiro wrote it. It's pretty funny. And then like a lot of Lima poems, they were dated. So Orfeo, as you heard, is a poem that's really full of objects, really full of people to the max. It's really chatty. The attention and the curiosity just move around at the speed of thought. Like, to me, this poem is what it sounds like to think, or what it feels like to think about things, and especially to think about people. It's full of everyday speech, really candid disclosures. My other marriages were like the 4 seasons that come and go. Lima's writing, but that's just after wondering if the pill will change the course of his daughter's future. if she too can kind of figure out how to leave the poet behind. I mean, there's like a real melancholy kind of there. In a lot of Lima's work, you kind of get this. His poems are like, they're wishes, but they're also regrets. And then when Lima writes them, as he says in the poem, he hears the voices of his entire poetic world, right? Here's Lorca hailing a cab, Ted Berrigan, dignifying wise guy poetry. It's really fitting to me that two of his books ended up being titled Inventory. There's the original one, and then later there was Inventory New and Selected, because I think Orfeo really exemplifies that, like listing and naming and counting, taking stock of, taking inventory, was definitely like such a beloved activity for the poet. He often, if you hear in the poem, he often stacks his lines in these really amazing small kind of musical repetitious runs, in this case in threes. I think for me as a young writer, I'd heard a lot of people talking about voice, and I was like, that's really abstract. Like, what does that mean? But sometimes then suddenly it's not. You hear a poet and you really kind of hear them. The other thing I love about this poem is that if Lima is in his poems, if he's ever interested in like aphorism or pithy language, right, it's always with a kind of wink. He always makes time to kind of undercut any belief that, you could go to the poem and the poem will like give you wisdom, give you advice, solve your problems for you. He loves to kind of play with the form of aphorism. Like here, for example, he's toying with the form in the beginning, the way you tell this kind of tale. But he says, in the beginning, there were small islands floating on poetry, which is really great. But then he follows that up with like a pretty comic and kind of epic, and it's honestly just he's just complimenting his friend. These islands belong to Joe Chiaravalo. He's kind of that pivot, I think, away from earnestness and aphorism is really amazing. And I also love that in this poem you get death is such a popular topic for aphorism and for aphoristic poems, but like this poet is just unwilling to try to explain death to you as if that's even possible. In this poem, all he will say is that death is incredible. It is man-made. I love that he chooses that word. Like, there's nothing more unknowable than something that's incredible. There's no like, you can't get further inside of it. I think it's really great. He also wrote kind of like this one, but also like the next one that I'll read, which is short. He wrote a lot of poems containing lines about writing poetry. A lot of people do that. Some of them are bad. Some of them are good, in my opinion, the Limas are some of the best across his lifetime of work. They also happen to be some of the earliest poems that I encountered. And so for someone who wrote so often about poetry, so convincingly, so frequently, he is pretty unromantic about its function. Just like in this first poem, he is he has a pretty funny sense of humor about, trying to like squeeze truth out of poetry, which you'll hear in this one. The poem is titled On Poetry, and then he has a pretty kind of like, I love kind of how he depicts poetry. So this is On Poetry. Below me, my feet are persistent. The marks on them are whispers. Of course, they do not respond to my obsessions. My obsessions collapse in order to sacrifice themselves. One might almost say I'm mad because I humble myself before gravity. The table I write on is stubborn. It defies gravity with its four legs and would sooner laugh at me. The definition of obsession is a pathological anxiety, fearsome, devious, that flirts with water. It is the exclusive influence of poetry. The poet's instability makes him obedient to a sheet of paper, and the slightest stir creates a small factory like childbirth and human stupidity. Poetry is pinker than nature, devastates every heart, but owes itself nothing. It does not require air, and it is not agile. The face of poetry is an expressive cut of meat that gives us a glimpse of truth. Picture like a Lady Gaga meat dress, but it's on your face. so, you can hear it. There's nothing sort of overly serious about poetry here, even though, Lima says that it's pinker than nature. There must be kind of something to it, and if its face, I'm joking, but, that even if its face is only kind of this expressive cut of meat, it still seems to imply that it sort of gives us enough truth to get by, which is maybe all you can ask for. Lima is always playing with the sardonic and the sentimental. They're always kind of flirting with each other. And even though he says in the poem that poetry is like not agile, and I feel like he says in other poems lots of other insults about poetry, which is great, it does seem that poetry is the one form that's agile enough to kind of live between sentimentality and like a sort of sardonic tone. So he is always really irreverent. He's never romantic about the power of poetry. And for someone like Frank Lima, who we can say kind of literally, materially was saved from a significantly briefer and worse by a lot life by poetry in a kind of literal way and by contact with poetry. He still doesn't worship it, and he definitely doesn't worship poets. There's a different poem that there's no time for me to read to you today, but he writes that in that poem, it's great that poets and mosquitoes have one thing in common, which is that they both suck. And I was 19, and I was like, yeah, I get that. A lot of his most tender poems, besides kind of, I think, having these qualities, are also his most everyday. And what's more everyday than parenting? If you are a parent, taking care of children, depicting fatherhood as something which like brings the world into really amazing relief. Like you see everything kind of clearly, even if we all know or that sometimes the world would be more palatable if we could like keep some of the blur around the edges, but children are like, no, I deny you that, So Christoph Lima is a poem about Lima's daughter, about taking his daughter to the movies. Also a snapshot of what he's calling divorced fatherhood, which is a very specific kind of fatherhood, as it should be. In Flushing in the mid-90s, cameo by Space Jam, which was what they went to see. The kind of ways that children ask really unbearable questions, and then as a parent, like, how do you answer them truthfully? And I think Lima's poem is really ultimately about this sort of painful knowledge that it's like, spoiler alert, our children will one day, in fact, grow up, and that's the part that kind of sucks, and also is the part that's really beautiful. So I'm going to read Christoph Lima. I scanned this wonkily just for you so that you could have an experience of, okay, Christoph Lima. Today, the sun came out to greet the People's Republic of Flushing, and I'm going to take my daughter to the movies. She is cinnamon and Italian like her mother's temper. She is brilliant blue like her mother's eyes. She is a brimming water glass of iridescent ideas about how I should grow up. A short walk paddling the sky toward the movie with the wind and the sun along Northern Boulevard. We're looking forward to popcorn with trace elements of fun. We'll stop by Puff and Smoke and pick up some 50-50 glycol fluid for my cloudless cigars. We'll have that unwarranted talk that divorced fathers have with a teenage daughter. We'll peel away her mother's deciduous, quote-unquote, visitation rights. This is the colorful democracy of divorce with its custodial incidents of children. I remember her face floating in her mother's arms, a lightly powdered football wrapped in pink. She is the ice and molten water that run across my life, burning the tears in the palm of my hand. My daughter is a teenage vegetarian who will not eat meatloaf because bovines are herbivores ruminating on sheets of grass dusted by atomic rain. I notice the lipstick she's wearing like a troubled heart, looking for mindless love and the quality of adult life forgotten by the seeds of the dead. I'm realizing that I could be like triggering parents of teenagers right now, so apologies. All these sort of teenageisms. I look up from our walk to notice the weather. The clouds are tinted with Catholic gray, violent repentance, and prudent parental support. Each word she speaks to me is a rarity, of pre-Columbian pottery living on borrowed time. After the movie Space Jam, black and white giraffes playing basketball with Bugs Bunny, I walk her home to her mother's fenestrations and tell her of my inflamed liver raging at me for covering it with cirrhosis, bourbon, and beer. She's afraid my liver will set the world on fire while I'm driving. She asks me if I'm going to die, and I tell her I will always be there for her, like the clean faces in an old photograph. At home, she shows me the bruises she suffered at her last hockey game. Her new stick is curved at the end like the canthus of a tiger's eye. She hugs me as if I were a giant pyramid. I think of the repetitive memory I'll leave her, all wrapped up in myself, exposing my side road of self-esteem and its harsh light of poetry, unrelenting and grinding, with its unexpected bits of sunshine. This is a poem where the moments really go by in the blink of an eye, right? A baby, which this is the best image of a baby just in poetry, period. I won't take no arguments. A lightly powdered football wrapped in pink. Like, how is it so irreverent and also so sweet? The baby is now a teenager, in the next stanza, refusing meatloaf, being a righteous vegetarian. You get the sense here that the poem can't stop time, although it desperately wants to stop time. And so besides to notice things, to notice the weather, a teenage child wearing lipstick to, perform adulthood, besides to notice what more can a dad or a poem really do, it's something that I think Lima suggests that in a situation where each word she speaks to me is a rarity, that to notice and keep noticing and even to kind of disclose to her, information that makes her suffer, which in this case, the fact that her growing up necessitates her father's decline, are things that, again, are worth doing. And his poems never excuse him from parental shortcomings. Like, you could give a whole other talk called like Frank Lima, Parental Shortcomings Poems, and that would also be really interesting. He wrote about it a lot. But his poems don't litigate on the life that the poet lives. The poem does not become, and I think this is really important, the poem is not like an emotional courtroom where punishment and judgment is doled out. The poem always has room for regret and for kind of stating things the way that it really was, but it's rarely interested in doling out judgment, and in my opinion, it's actually pretty interested usually in like a super scrupulous truth. It doesn't tip into exaggeration, even though it could. So I'll give you an example. She asked me if I'm going to die, and I tell her, I will always be there for her, like the clean faces in an old photograph. The like there is doing a lot of work, like the clean faces in an old photograph, as in that Lima will someday, be there as a clean face in an old photograph, maybe on like a nightstand or something. So literally always there for her, but absolutely not there with her. There's something really specific, I think, about that promise. So in the meantime, the poem, sort of relies on these unexpected bits of sunshine to sort of get by. So the next poem I'm going to read is called "I'm Tired," which I really thought that I related to also when I was like a young person, but I don't think I was like capital T tired. I was just like regular tired. And you'll see in the poem that my tired did not deserve lines like that are in this poem. But this poem really makes it clear that for Lima, again, right, poetry is nothing compared to life. Is always secondary to life. And this doesn't degrade poetry in any way. This actually is something really amazing about life. I sort of love that for him, those two things are not equal. It's the question is always, can poetry support living? So, I was really, again, in no position to declare, to declare the poems have discolored my life. And I feel lucky that I still don't feel like declaring that. But this very kind of agonizing poem of comparing life and poetry has always really affected me. So this is I'm tired. These are prehistoric marks that were photocopied from like a 19-year-old me. They're like still there. They're like the Chauvet cave etchings. Okay, I'm tired. I want you to grow old with me, i.e. to catch up with me as I am becoming increasingly weary of writing poems to you. The poems have discolored my life. I'm tired of the mysterious truth after I touch you. I'm tired of not knowing what you think about. I'm tired of women who have the same name as you. They don't know that I'm tired of them too. I'm tired of the telephone, of its beige lips telling me they love me and that you don't, that you are a figment in my ear. I don't want my poems to wear out anyone else again. I don't want to die and have this machine at my bedside holding my hand, draping me with its affectionate black ribbon, wondering who will turn it on when I'm gone, wondering if my soul will become a kiss again. So you have this image at the end of the typewriter. It could be other things, but it could also be a typewriter, as like this machine that, would hold the poet's hand on their deathbed, would drape him with its, affectionate black ribbon. That's always really stayed with me. Lima's poems were pretty reliably like a chronicle of real things that happened. So we could read this kind of like anti-wish poem as a poem about not wanting one's life or the things that one has done or said or fucked up, to wear out anybody else again. Like the typewriter, I think it's important, appears at the bedside in lieu of anybody else. And so whatever kind of affection it brings is really no comfort. So to me, I read it as writing being a pretty poor bedside nurse who maybe they're reliable and will appear when nobody else will, but that it's also kind of ironically it's terrible job if one has lived a life where it would be the only thing at the bedside. And I think Lima held that fear better than most. So here I'm going to make a really short biographical note. I think it's relevant to the feeling of the poem. In Lima's development as a poet, and I think this is important, it was 100% not after, like, quote unquote, transcending poverty or abuse or what we call struggle, right? That he was like rewarded, as this kind of cultural narrative often goes, with contact with literary mentors, contact with the literary world. It was actually the opposite. It was really in the often the very turbulent midst of these kind of experiences and spaces that this contact would happen. So for example, when he was in juvenile drug rehab, when he was 17, he met the artist Sherman Drexler, who gave him his earliest poems to read, encouraged him to write, and this is like an experience that would affect him for the rest of his life. I think Lima's life really challenges this idea of redemption, and again, if in air quotes, following a certain chronology. Think about in film and in television, like this type of contact with art and writing is often presented as like the end point. It's like the last 10 minutes of the movie, right? But we all know that meeting a mentor does not in fact solve all your problems, and absolutely neither does poetry. In fact, sometimes it gives you more problems, right? But I think that's sort of important to say. So Frank O'Hara himself really understood, as many of us do, that you actually can't pay your rent in poems, that will not be accepted. And so he looked after Frank Lima's material needs for much of his life. He often found him a place to live, food to eat. In one case, he directed prize money to Lima and away from Lima's co-winner, because the co-winner's dad was a doctor, and Frank O'Hara was like, you don't need this money, and he directed it towards Lima because he definitely did. And another time he literally gave him money to see a therapist. For me, besides this being, of course, interesting, I think it's in this way that the New York School to me is more interesting than just a sort of aesthetic moment. I mean, these are artists and writers who resourced each other in a very kind of material way before they had any kind of, or while they were also having this sort of aesthetic impact on each other. And I think that also is really important to kind of acknowledge. So I'm going to finish by reading a poem that I referenced earlier, and then I'll tell you a funny story about it. It's my favorite Frank Lima poem. If I had to choose, no one technically made me choose, but I guess I made me choose. So this is Poem from Amor. And then if you have questions, I would be happy to chat. Thanks for being here. This is so nice. So this is Poem from Amor. There are no bones in poverty and pain. You advise me to write poems of insanity, poems of a face eternally hidden by laughter. Spain's greatest architect slept with you a quarter of a century ago. Now I am your youngest poet and fill your bed with ink. In the other world, in other words, I threw away my shoes looking for you on the throat of a flower. The eyes of the Brolican lack the great gentleness of paradise, and I live in the vague terror you will call and offer me a summer song and coffee. So this is my story in closing. I once won a very modest, but obviously to me very important poetry prize with a poem that I titled, Now I Am Your Youngest Poet and Fill Your Bed with Ink, because I thought, and I still think, that it's like the best line of poetry ever written. I was like obsessed with it. I didn't hide, of course, that it was like a Frank Lima line, right? But to this day, I feel embarrassed that I would set myself up like that I would title a poem a line so amazing that how, you know what I mean? It's so impossible to follow. Why would I do that? And also at the time, more than one person was like, the title is the best line. How did you come up with that? You know? and then I was like, oh, I don't know. I did it. And it got really quiet, you know? But I titled it with the Lima line, because I did want to nod to his influence on me, my life as a young poet at the time. I really understood this Lima poem to be about influence and poetic inheritance. I don't want to overread the poem or any of his poems ever in the context of class, but I do think it's undeniable, right, that many of Lima's contemporaries were educated in these elite spaces. That's not to dismiss in any way like the range of their experiences, but it does make them inheritors of a literary tradition that, like, Frank Lima was not supposed to enter. It was not designed for him to enter. So where a different poet, I think, may consider themselves as writing poems of virtuosity, right? Poems of technique, poems of, insert different word here. For Lima to wonder what it means to write poems of insanity, I think to me is also really singular. I think that what he understood is that poverty and pain are they are themselves lineages. They produce poems all the same, even if sort of unwillingly. And it's something that Lima never, ever, ever shied away from writing about. So for me, like the vague terror in this poem, yes, it kind of slips in masquerading as a more innocuous image that you joked about also at the beginning of the talk. Like, your crush would call you and ask you to go out for coffee, and that's like scary and titillating and exciting. But I read it, of course, as like doubly articulating the terror of influence and of being identified as, I'll put it this, like having come from exactly what one comes from. And I think a lot of, myself included, a lot of poets relate to that kind of feeling, that fear. So in the poem, there's absolutely nothing at all in the world that is nearly as terrifying. So for these reasons, and I think sort of other reasons too, I've always turned back to Lima as like the best example of kind of how to write through and around that animating fear, as opposed to sort of spending a lifetime outrunning it. So this is my favorite Lima poem. Thank you for spending the time, and yeah, thanks.
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? I can pass the mic around.
No hard ones, please.
Okay.
This is not really a question. It's just, I love these poems, and now I'm going to go read Frank Lima.
Mission accomplished. Thank you. Thank you. Aren't they good? Aren't they just amazing? And there's just so many more where these come from, and I wasn't kidding about there's so many Frank Limas. You could just take the path of poems on poetry. You could just take a path of like Family Man, Frank Lima, poems on parenting. I mean, there's just poems on boxing, poems on like surviving toxic male violence. There's so many. He lived so much, and there's just so much work that we haven't even, read yet.
Hey, I was curious about why you think his work kind of has been lost to time a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a combination of a lot of things, right? One is, not to make it all sound, I think, accidental. I mean, Frank Lima himself ostensibly left the poetry scene like in the mid-'70s. He had a pretty successful career as a chef. He cooked for the White House at some point, was like very proud of that fact. But, some of it was intentional withdrawal, and so not being in spaces and conversations. But also, to be the kind of canonical figures of the New York School scene, maybe I'll put it this way, you have to sort of like be around to be around, you know what I mean? And if you are not around because you are working, struggling, literally not around, in and out, incarcerated, in and out of jail, trying to pay your rent, not paying your rent, living, crashing with a friend, you're not around. So it's a combination of a lot of factors. And I also just think that the narrative around the New York School also is, it's a little bit neater if we sort of footnote him, which I think is what has happened. But again, this book has been really important. I mean, I just thank you, City Lights, for really giving him, I think, the kind of new and selected, large new and selected treatment that I think does signify something in like a poetry landscape, that he's deserving of this treatment, right? That's a great question.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, Wendy. We'll be here until 9 p.m. So feel free to hang out until then. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.